Hvala lepa. Dobar dan. As you can probably tell, I'm American, but you can probably tell from the last name that I'm also Slovenian. My family moved from Slovenia to the United States after the Second World War, so it's a delight to be here, and frankly an honor to speak before all of you, and particularly in this institution. So thank you very much for the organizers and for the government for having me. What I thought I'd do today is talk a bit about the international tribunals, because in many ways, the focus that we're talking about today is to help prevent these terrible atrocities. But unfortunately, in the past, we've done a not so great job of preventing atrocities. So we wound up having these tribunals that put the good judge and myself to work trying to deal with the aftermath. And in many ways, I would suggest that one of the reasons we have these tribunals is to deal with the guilt that all of us feel because we didn't prevent things. And this happens not just from the past atrocities in other countries, but it's going on right now. I mean, we are looking at crises going on in the world, and there are people building cases, and they're building cases because people aren't involved in trying to stop it actively. And so it's something that our world leaders have to consider more. Where should we be focusing our use of resources and time and energy? Should we be more proactive, or should we deal with the aftermath? So what I'd like to do today is talk about a couple of different things. I'll go discuss the past tribunals, the current tribunals. I'll discuss some of the crimes that are perpetrated and they're investigated, and then I'll talk a bit about the reasons we have war crimes tribunals, and perhaps we can leave that to a discussion afterwards if we have time. So of course, the first tribunal we all know about is the one from Nuremberg. This is the one that really set things in motion in terms of fighting impunity. Before this, people perpetrated terrible crimes and nothing really happened to them. So this started the process of the fight against impunity. Of course, in addition to Nuremberg, we had the tribunals in Tokyo. And then there was a big gap of many, many years before you had the international tribunals, the ad hoc tribunals. There were one for Rwanda and also from Yugoslavia. Of course, everyone in this room recognizes Mr. Milosevic. You also have the tribunal in Rwanda. But these aren't it. We have many other tribunals around the world that are active in the work they're doing. The Special Court for Sierra Leone is one of them. It's an ad hoc tribunal, which I think in many ways, to the extent we're going to have more tribunals separate from the ICC, I think these hybrid tribunals are probably a way to consider working with domestic courts and also the international community. You have Saddam Hussein with the Iraqi High Tribunal. You have the extraordinary chambers in Cambodia, where actually a colleague of the judge and I, Andrew Cayley, is now the chief prosecutor there. Again, working very hard to bring some sense of justice to the people who have suffered so much. Of course, we also have the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which is working now in its own cases. And the latest and greatest of international tribunals is the International Criminal Court, and it's going through, I think, a growing process, but hopefully there'll be more focus on the good work that it's doing. Of course, all these tribunals look at terrible crimes in many capacities: war crimes, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And so I thought I'd highlight some of those. Those from the region are well familiar with what happened in Bosnia and Sarajevo. And of course, these are the crimes that the tribunal focuses on, is such crimes as shelling of, in this case, this is the main newspaper in Sarajevo. You've got the parliament that also was shelled in Sarajevo. But also you have camps. And of course, the camps were mentioned earlier today from Prijedor region, Amarska and Karaturm. And these, of course, were images to shock the world and in many ways inspired countries to become more proactive in terms of trying to fight these atrocities. These tribunals also look at murder cases. And this is indeed some images that we had that came before the tribunal in terms of murders that were perpetrated. And I should warn you, and I should have done this beforehand, that some of the images that we'll continue to show are very shocking. And I show them to you because it's one thing to talk in the abstract about the terrible crimes that are happening, but it's another to be seen focused on them. And indeed, some people said, listen, you shouldn't show these photos, but I think the reason why the international community is so pledged to do this work, the reason why, for instance, the Genocide Tribunal, the good judge and I worked at, spends $100 million a year on these efforts is because the atrocities are so intense. Of course, these crimes don't happen just in Bosnia, they happen all around the world. Of course, we had investigators going to Iraq after Iraq changed governments to investigate the crimes that were going on there, to build cases. But I thought because we're here in the Balkans, because we're here in Sarajevo, that something that I would like to talk to you and share more about is an experience that I had working as the most junior baby young prosecutor at the tribunal, working on the Srebrenica case. Because in many ways, the judge and I, and all those people who were in this room that worked at the tribunal, we were part of the world's belated response to the genocide. And I think we've all learned from this, and the reason we're so passionate about this is because of how cases like this impacted us. Of course, those people from the region know that Srebrenica lies between Serbia and Bosnia. And they know that the enclave and the safe area that was declared and how close that is from other areas where the actual killing happened is, I mean, very, very close. If you go from Sarajevo, from Srebrenica up to Podachari and make a left, you go up to Zvornik. And this is where many thousands of people were slaughtered. Just so close for those people who are impacted by it. And it's a wonder how so few people have come forward to testify in terms of what happened in their own backyards. I have some background on the area, but frankly, I think everyone in this room is well aware of what happened during the war, about the Security Council resolutions that established a safe area, the fact that the Dutch FAT were sent in to help protect and to maintain security of that region, and what happened afterwards. And the challenge with these cases, I think, when you look at how they proceed, is for the international community, when you prosecute these cases, the internationals that come to look at these cases, we're from all different backgrounds. So we know very little about what's going on at the time. We have to learn it ourselves to build a case. And the challenge of that is we have to look at documents. And of course, this is one of the strategic objectives that we had to look at, that looks at removing the Drina as a border between the Serbian states. We had to understand what the state of mind was for those individuals that were perpetrating these crimes. And indeed, one of the documents that we looked at to understand the true gravity of what the Bosnian Serb forces were looking to do at this time is this directive. This directive was going to the Drina Corps. This is basically General Mladic, the head of the Bosnian Serb army, directing General Krstić, and we heard the Krstić case mentioned today, directing him to take certain operations. And I'll read this quote to you. It says the following. It calls for the complete physical separation of Srebrenica from Žepa. Žepa was another safe area. Should be carried out as soon as possible, preventing even communications between individuals in the two enclaves. By planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Žepa. Now, I would submit to you that this is an incredibly powerful statement because it demonstrates the commander's intent. What was General Mladic and his colleagues thinking in terms of conducting this operation? And I think it demonstrates some of the things that were spoken to earlier about having notice about what's going on so the international community can respond before these things happen. And indeed, as everyone in this room knows, on the 11th of July, 1995, the Bosnian Serb army decides to enter Srebrenica. And thousands of people run to the safety of the international community, to Podachari. In this image here, you can see there's a street and there's a little gray mat in the middle. That's thousands of people who are fleeing to the Dutch VAT, to the UN, to the international community that are here, as they believe, to save them. And as this crowd forms, the Serbs decided to separate the men from the women. This image here, think of the base of this line of column of men, where Serbs are separating young men and boys from their families. The general idea was to separate men of fighting age, 16 to 65. And we have witnesses that came to the tribunal that testified that this was a bit of a split between Sophie's Choice and Schindler's List. Sophie's Choice because in many cases, this was the last moments where women, mothers, were able to see their sons before they were ripped out of their arms. And about mothers who came to the tribunal with such guilt because they felt if they just held on a little harder, a little stronger, the Serbs would not have taken their child away, because when the child was taken, they were never seen again, because they were all executed. They referred to it as Schindler's List because, much like in Germany, in the case of the living list, the Serbs were offered the UN agencies. And this was a huge UN operation. So many different UN agencies had personnel there. And if you were to add your name to a list of people who worked for the UN, you were saved. And for those people who weren't, they weren't. Every person you see in this photograph was executed. There's not a single survivor. We looked for every single one. Those people who were separated, the men and the boys, all their personal belongings, their identification cards, were taken from them. This was interesting because at the time, the Serbs had said that they wanted to screen, the reason they're separating the men from the women was to screen people as possible war criminals. And one of the UN observers asked one of the Serb soldiers, if you're meant to be separating and screening people, why then are you taking away their identity documents? Presumably you need to have an identity card to see if they match a list of people who may be suspected war criminals. And the response at that time was the fact they did not need these documents for where they're going, which leads one to believe that there was already a plan hatched to execute these individuals, and the hope was to destroy any record that they existed. So separate from those people who ran for the UN protection, others decided to make their own run for it and to run in the direction of Tuzla, because that was a Bosnian safe area. And so those people decided to run that direction. Unfortunately, the Serbs knew they were going that direction, so they tried to ambush and capture as many as possible. This is the Sandici Meadow, and the gray matter you see in the center, bottom right corner, are thousands of people have been basically collected. And you can see on the road the buses and trucks, they're basically being parked there to move people onto these vehicles to take them to execution sites. And this is another football field in Kasaba. The same thing happened. This is actually a location where General Mladic came out and told people, don't worry, don't be afraid. You're here for prisoner exchange. And this is something that happened during the war. Different sides, the Serbs, the Muslims, the Croats, would capture people and exchange them. And this was a way to keep people calm from trying to revolt against their captors, because frankly, the people who were captured vastly outnumbered the Serbs that had their weapons pointed at them. And one of the challenges for us prosecutors is trying to demonstrate that in these cases, the people who are the commanders, in this case General Krstić, or in the case going on now, General Mladic, they understood what was going on the ground. And I think one important aspect of this is the fact that we had to get combat reports and other documents that we could present to the judges to understand what's happening. And this, for me, was an important fact because in many cases, you can't just ask the governments or individuals, can you please send us these documents? This will be surprising to you. They don't want to send them. So we were fortunate in the fact that we had SFOR, basically a military force in Bosnia, that was there to help us. And I can tell you that when we conducted search warrants, and I was actively involved in these, it's, for me as a lawyer, it's very helpful to know that I have a piece of paper signed by a judge in The Hague that says I can enter and take documents. But I have to tell you, when you go to a military installation in eastern Bosnia, the military, the soldiers standing in front of the gate, may not be overly impressed with my little piece of paper. What they are impressed by is the international community acting collectively. The fact that with me were Special Forces bodyguards from the American Army, the fact that we had British military there as well, and the Italian Carabinieri for riot control. That's what really actively allows the execution of the rule of law. And so I think when we talk about how we look forward to these matters is how governments, how international organizations work collectively with the military, because they are an important role in these operations. This is one of the combat reports that basically describes the challenges that the Zvornik Brigade commander has in terms of maintaining security over the individuals and asking for reinforcements. So those people who are captured were taken, I said, up the road to various execution locations. This is one of them. This is the Plic Cultural Center. It's basically, if you walk in, it's a theater. This is what it looks like inside. And this is where the Serbs rounded up a couple hundred people. They forced them into this auditorium. And these people were unarmed. And the Serbs went to the top where the projector would be for a movie theater. They lined up with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns, and they opened fire, slaughtering everyone inside. And you can see, when you look at the image, the blast marks and the human tissue on the wall of the destruction that occurred. This is the Krivica warehouse. This is a place where the Serbs basically collected about 1,200 people and packed them in the warehouse. You can see from the image the pot marks on the wall. That's for machine gun fire. And indeed, this is an image that was taken after the slaughter of those people that are there. You can see the bodies falling outside of the warehouse. And that's because when the Serbs came to this location, they didn't have enough people to kill everyone at the same time. And you can see the warehouse is quite long. So the Serbs went to one side of the warehouse, threw open the doors, lined up with machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and slaughtered one half of the room. They then closed those doors, walked to the other side, opened up those doors, and again opened fire. After they did this, they weren't able to kill everyone. And so they actually asked, "Is anyone okay? Please let us know." And people, thinking that they would be saved, stood up, said, "Yes, I'm fine, I'm not hurt." And individually, the Serbs went around and went boom, 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 and killed those people who declared themselves to be survivors. Now, how do we know this? We know this because we have witnesses from this case. Witnesses that we found that came to the tribunal, risked their lives and the lives of their family to testify before the good judge and his colleagues, to share their stories. And they talked about the first volley of gunfire, where they fell to the ground and their bodies, their friends and family, fell around them, and taking the brunt of the impact of the bullets. They then testified that they are worried about drowning in the blood of their family and friends, because there's over 1,000 people in this room, so the blood is pouring everywhere. And they then testified that they're worried about being buried alive. Why? Because the Serbs came in with backhoes to scoop up the bodies, to put on trucks, to take to mass graves. Thankfully for these individuals, in between, the Serbs there decided to take a cigarette break, and they made a run for it. They ran out the back window, you can see, and up the hill. And they came to the tribunal to testify to the terrible atrocities that happened. So these individuals were very mass graves, but later on the Serbs went to change the graves, to basically rob them, to try to distribute the number of bodies in various locations. This is the Branivo State Farm. This was a location where the Serbs went and basically dug up huge trenches to serve as mass caves and shot people in the back. Then they fell in and then covered the graves. This is what an exhumation looks like when the international team of experts went to dig up the bodies. And what's interesting about this is the fact that as you dig down deeper, bodies decompose based upon their exposure to oxygen. So at the top level, you have the bones that you saw from the pictures earlier. As you go lower and lower, you actually see people. And I can tell you that when you go to these mass graves, they're incredibly powerful, not just for the sight, but for the smell of death. It's sticky. It sticks to your clothes. And indeed, it's a reminder of the terrible atrocities that happen, because even when you leave the site, when you go back to Holland, in my case, to The Hague, it still clings to your shores. It's incredibly powerful. Now, what was interesting about this case was the sheer operation of the slaughter. People were not just killed, there was an operation. They were blindfolded. Their hands were tied behind their backs. And then they were killed. And indeed, this is one of the iconic pictures, I think, of the Srebrenica case. You can see a body face down in a ditch. His eyes are blindfolded, and his hands are tied behind his backs. This happened time and time again, thousands of times over. And indeed, many of the massacres I mentioned were robbed. And you can see in this case that we did an initial exhumation, and then they recognized where the backhoe had scooped up additional bodies, which makes it incredibly challenging for the international community to determine the number of bodies, because bodies are split between different locations. This was one of the skulls that was found, in fact, when I was in Bosnia at the time. And you can see there's a hole
and the head. And for those of you who follow forensic work, you know if there's an entry wound from a bullet, there's usually an exit wound. And oftentimes a bullet will come in and tumble through the body, ripping apart your insides, and it'll spit out somewhere else. Well, in this case, we found entry wounds, but no exit wounds. And we're trying to understand what happened. And a team of our investigators went down to Bosnia, and they recognized that in that area, there is actually a cattle farm. How many people in this room have seen the American movie, No Country for Old Men? Anyone here? You recognize from that movie, one of the actors from the movie has an air canister with a hose with a bolt that pops out. You remember this? This is what the Serbs used to kill these people. There was an embargo on at the time, so of course bullets are expensive. And what the Serbs decided to do was to, rather than wasting bullets on people who are being held, to use this humane killer, basically put this device on people's heads, turn on the hose, a bolt pops out and kills them. We received at the tribunal tremendous support from a number of countries, and I'd say amazing support by the US government. One of the things we did was doing search warrant operations and collecting the shell casings from the various execution locations, and then conducting search warrants where we test fired the weapons from different commands to try to do matching with their alcohol, tobacco, firearms. We went and did forensic testing of the blast marks in the human tissue to try to do matching of bodies. And of course, there's an incredible number of people who are missing from the war and missing from the Srebrenica case. At the time, at least 7,475 people were declared missing. But I should say that that number is a very conservative estimate because we use the number from the International Committee for the Red Cross. Because in order to be declared missing, you need to be described as missing by a close family member. So imagine if every person in your family has been killed, there's no one to report you as missing. So therefore, you would not appear. We've recovered thousands of bodies. The international community has recovered thousands of bodies from all different ages, but as young as 9 and as old as 90. And the bodies we recovered, some had prosthetic legs and arms. These people caused no threat, but they're slaughtered nonetheless. The crimes of Srebrenica were committed in the zone of responsibility of General Krstić, who, as we heard, was convicted for aiding and abetting genocide, and also under the command of Mladic and Karadzic. This is Krstić in his battle dress uniform, and this is also on the right, him in court. He was eventually sentenced to 46 years, and unfortunately, in my opinion, it was reduced to 35 years afterwards. We can talk more about that. We have other cases that have come forward the tribunal. These are two of them, Obrenović and Nikolić. And I'm happy to say that in the past, when I gave this talk, two people who are outstanding, still running from the law, was Mladic and Karadzic. I'm incredibly pleased to say that justice waits, and they catch up with people. And these individuals are now in The Hague, being prosecuted by our former colleagues. So why do we have these tribunals? I'll just leave a couple thoughts. First is retribution for the victims, retribution for society, justice for the victims, perhaps. Is it also for the historical records? So years from now, when people are trying to say, this didn't happen, the numbers are too large. We know that these cases went before a court, and they are proven beyond a reasonable doubt that these cases in fact happened. It's about reconciliation. An important fact of the tribunals, it's about individual responsibility. The tribunals are focused on people and not entire populations, saying this individual perpetrated this crime. Does it also promote the rule of law? Because in many countries, the rule of law is something that's an aspiration. It's not just something there, it's every day, something we have to work at. Is it for deterrence? Do having these tribunals convince people that when in doubt, let's not pull the trigger? And we can talk more about that. And lastly, is it about guilt? Is it about all of us, our national leaders, and our international community, for not stepping in and doing more to try to prevent these atrocities in the first place? So I'm glad we're here today to talk about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vlasic.